Awesome. Hi. It's so nice to meet you for real.
Yeah.
Let's introduce ourselves then. Do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Maya. I'm an undergrad, first year, at UCSB studying creative writing. And well, in my like writing degree, it's part of like creative writing, writing studies, and literary studies. But I have an emphasis in creative writing and writing studies. And I'm also studying the history of public policy and law. Mostly because I like history, and it's with an emphasis in disability history, disability policy. And the policy side comes in because like legislation around disability is just, very important. And it's also important, to like look at the ways that like we have historically and politically viewed disability and in ways that like have impacted like the ways that disabled people can legally live in like, the silent genocides of like being impoverished in America, like the resources that aren't available because of policy, like seeing those gaps.
Mm, awesome. Yeah, I'm so excited to hear more. I'm Ame Min-Venditti, and my current work is in water and narratives. I would say I'm really interested in the overlap of like transformations that we need, like socially, environmentally, and our relationships, and like kind of cultivating that relational understanding and ethic, which is very influenced by Indigenous thought. And so also like opening up more epistemic diversity and like understandings, holding space for other people. Which again, it can be hard when there's a lot of these like systems of oppression and political structures that are pitting people against each other. I would say I'm inspired by the communities I work with, and also like my own community, which I'm trying to find a way to like work with my own community, and that's we'll see what happens. But yeah, uh, how about I ask you one of your questions? Um, how do you balance your identity as a scholar and a marginalized person, especially when working in subjects centering your identity?
I was thinking about this morning because I was thinking about your work in like communal like I'm gonna go with communal communities, I guess. um and like the relationship
Mhm.
between people and the environment, and I was like I know that a lot of academia is very invalidating of communal work like ethnographies and stuff like that. Like it's just not really considered, let alone like already working with the environment. It's a very racist field because of like the whiteness of the approach. Um, and then I was thinking about like my own
Yeah.
experience in disabled academia, not only as being a disabled student and having to like remember that like my non-traditional like approach to academia is still valid, and it is like an expression of my disability, an expression of my identity, and I don't have to follow traditional academic um ideologies to be a valid academic. um and that's
Mm-hmm.
just like very hard to grasp,
Mm-hmm.
especially like as someone who is chronically ill. It's like I have to balance between going to class and like taking care of my health and doing research projects and taking care of my health. Um, which is something that everyone has to deal with because everyone has a relationship with their health, but like I just have to spend more time with my health. Um, and I think something that's really
Mm-hmm.
important to me is recognizing that like disabled theory, queer theory, like critical race theory, it's not just something that exists within the academic bubble. It's something that like impacts daily life. It is experiential and it's theoretical, but it's not theoretical in the sense that like it isn't real. It's just theoretical in the sense that like we're thinking about it more critically and sociologically. So it's been very validating for me to like look at social media and like crit blogs, which is like a form of communication that's very popular within the disability community, of like sharing health journeys on Instagram, sharing like your disability advocacy through blogs, like that kind of a thing. And remembering like that is also a part of disability justice, that is a part of disability theory, that is the disabled experience. And of course, there's the tie between like disability justice and the like the first proponent of disability justice, the like first principle is intersectionality and recognizing like disability impacts everyone, and it especially marginalizes people who are racially and ethnically marginalized, and that we need to follow the leadership of people who have been disabled by their ethnicity and by their race. Um, and
Mm,
so stuff like that has been like very validating to be like, you know, I can read something that isn't necessarily academic. I can like just look at something and be like, oh, okay, like I get it. Like this is my academic understanding of this, and I know like in a traditional academic sense, like a professor was talking about how like people don't want to read Shakespeare anymore, and I'm like, okay, like yeah, I'm like I can read Shakespeare and I can also read like Leia Lakshmi and be like, yeah, this is both of these are important, but like one is more interesting to me and one is more relevant to me. Um, and so I think like just stuff like that where it's like recognizing the community and even outside of academia.
hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Um, I would agree that like learning from the world is kind of the point of like what we would call higher education, right? It's just like spending more energy or devoting more energy to learning, and so limiting ourselves to sources that are, in a traditional discipline developed by the same people who developed all the other oppressive systems. Like I feel like that's a disservice to us, and I mean thus like everyone in our collective liberation. I think starting my PhD 2 years ago and being exposed to professors who were creative in their pedagogy, like intentionally, and also sort of habitually culturally different, was very freeing. And I feel very fortunate that the sustainability program at our school has space for those folks, although I would not say they're centered. I would say again, margins within margins, right? And that's a good point also about intersectionality. It's that's part of my own work, self work, and otherwise. I think the self work I did before starting my PhD is a big part of the work I'm doing now, which is looking at trauma and looking at sort of intersectional systems of like identity and violence, which kind of, like I think when we hear intersectionality these days, a lot of people think of intersecting identities as opposed to intersecting um like situatedness within these systems, which is where it originally came from, right? And so being able to balance, the importance of people being conscious of where they're situated, their positionality, and then also like what does that mean in terms of how we organize, who we prioritize when we're designing policy and that kind of thing. So I guess I feel that certainly I'm part of, like I hold multiple marginalized identities, and yet also I hold a lot of privilege. So that's a constant tension. I guess like my answer to how do I balance that is like not super well and always awkwardly, but like I try really hard to recognize that. And like I one interesting thing I would say is a lot of my work has been in Latin America, or with indigenous communities in Arizona. Um, and I feel like the power that I hold in those communities, like that shifts, that power adjustment is something that I'm really cognizant of. And it helps me, well, both like attune to how race presents socially in different parts of the world. And also like the like stepping out of academia, you see, okay, the academic bubble of like there's money everywhere, there's opportunities everywhere. Certainly that's not like, it doesn't mean daily it's like utopic or high class, but at the same time, comparatively, it is. So I guess those are the pieces of how I balance my identity and sort of positionality. and I guess we'll talk about it more later, but like always trying to find ways to use research funds or other resources to help what communities in the ways they actually need. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to
Um,
put it. Do you want to go to the situated in the academy for whom is our knowledge? Because I think we're like leaning into that right now. Situated in the
yeah.
academy for whom is our knowledge? What systems of oppression and liberation are we engaging with now and hopefully in our future careers? Do you want to go first, or?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Um, so yeah, that's kind of exactly what I was saying is sort of, well, what's the point of it? If the point of it's writing more papers that are published behind a paywall, that or else in order to publish it open access, I have to pay thousands or of dollars. Like that just seems counter to what the point of learning is, which is in my case, like collective liberation, right? The idea of what there's no the science for the sake of it is kind of what has you know come to all of the places we are now, I think. That's one thing in my program I see a lot, which I guess is this is a critique and also like it's a helpful reminder to myself. This sort of technocratic view of, okay, well, we're solutions oriented, so we're gonna throw stuff at the problems that we identify based on our worldview, um, based on who and what we're prioritizing, right, in terms of our values. So, like, I think it comes down to that ultimately. I see this as a problem because in my value system and in my worldview, this is not aligned, but that doesn't consider other people's worldviews and what's not aligned. And so I guess I see a lot of the, okay, we're going to model, we're going to make predictions, we're going to make economic models, we're going to make policy recommendations, which I'm not against policy recommendations, but in my field, it's sort of like, okay, so the energy transition process and all of the systems involved are all operating in a capitalist and let's just say, like, I don't know how to describe our democratic government system that I would also say is capitalist system, right? It's that doesn't seem like it's going to solve the problems that came from originally more unfettered science and progress, right? Like that's what caused this was too much consumption and of greenhouse gases and a lot of the other things that came from science. So anyway, I would say those are sort of some of the systems that I see is this technocratic like elevation of like, okay, science, numbers, like how do we justify this for money? And then like the economic side of things where it's like, oh well, call we're not even gonna use the word well-being, we're gonna use, like utility instead. Just these little things that I feel like they're kind of silly. They feel like silly critiques of those giant fields, but at the same time, fundamentally, those are oppressing like not only people and more than human creatures, but also like different ways of thinking. So it's like repressive and oppressive. So I guess my hope for the future and my career is that I continue to push on these. I think in the last 2 years, I've been trying really hard to be in community with people who can like help me see more critically and think more critically. Um, and that's great. But it also sort of like it's got me like steeled and be like, okay, I have to be ready to go back into that space where I will be the minority, I will be marginalized, like it will be really hard to be heard, but like in order to move some of those conversations, I guess. So yeah. How about you? I wonder who do you feel like you're creating knowledge for or with, and in what context?
I feel what you were saying really hard about like moving into spaces where like you are in community and then moving into like the academic space and you're just like, okay, well, I guess my work isn't valued here. And I'm gonna have to constantly fight. Because there is that like cognitive dissonance essentially within my work of like it is for my community and it is with my community. And I believe heavily in the idea of intellectual accessibility, which is like me using my own privilege to like generate these sources of knowledge and then like making it publicly accessible. Like I think social media is very helpful with that. Like the blogs I mentioned before, like that is a way that people like learn how to like be in relationship with their bodies and learn how to be in relationship with other people who have like disabilities and stuff. And so those things are really like valuable. And I also recognize my own privilege of being like a white person in academia, um, who is like able to go through academia, who is able to get these like not very useful degrees, frankly. Um, and like I can live in the academic bubble, but that also doesn't invalidate my experiences within the academic bubble of like being marginalized and of being hurt. And I think that's also where the my sense of community comes in, where it's like, yes, I recognize my privilege, but it is still okay to be hurt and to come into these spaces feeling hurt and privileged, as long as it's not like weaponized or like a violent way of doing it, like if it's consensual, that kind of a thing. I think that's very important. And I think like essentially who I create knowledge for, the reason I do what I do is because I want people to have the resources that like they otherwise won't be able to access. Like why I study policy is so that I can propose policies that like will get get the basic resources to the people who need them. That way we can have more progress and more liberation. Because like I think what communities have done within their communities is very important, very valuable. But I also know that it's something that weighs heavily on them. And that like if they had resources provided to them to continue this work and to have it expanded, it would lighten a burden, so to speak, and it would like create stronger communities, stronger bonds because people have difficulty being in community when you're constantly working, you're constantly exhausted, you're like under this repressive regime of capitalism. Um, and so I think that's really important. And then also, yeah, that's why I study policy and that's why I study history. And I also just think it's important to hold knowledge of our past because it I don't know if I so much believe this, but like knowledge like or like our past lives in our bodies or like the idea where like if trauma lives in our bodies, like you can cut your hair and like feel relieved from trauma. And like I have experienced that. I don't know if it's like pseudoscientific or whatever, but like that is like intergenerational trauma especially like is a great way of putting it. So if we don't know these histories, if we don't hold this knowledge within ourselves, then we won't be able to understand like our present and our future. And I think that's depressing. Like we should be able to honor our ancestors but also recognize that what they wanted was for us to have these liberatory processes, to not necessarily live in a utopia, but like to work together for like a better world.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I agree. I think that I'm really glad you brought up like history and sort of time in general, and bodies and embodiment. I feel like that those are two kind of dimensions of thought and analysis that I've been really interested in. I'm not sure exactly how it intersects or flows together with water yet, but I guess it every story has those elements, whether we acknowledge it or not. And that's some of the work I've been doing. I guess I'd love to share a little bit about that, in the context of sort of world making, world building, um, futuring, however we want to call it. So the last 2 years, including or like almost 2 years, I've worked on several projects about embodiment and like knowing within, I guess, this sort of environmental social space. And this isn't something that's new, right? And we don't want to claim that, but we do encourage and try to facilitate practice within academic spaces of living in our bodies, listening to our bodies, expressing through movement, and so on, what we know and what we're dreaming of. So a couple of those examples, one is the data humanization method. One of my colleagues, Adrian Yannick, who's a art professor and also a fellow sustainability PhD student, developed this method for public performance a while ago and was using basically their body to process these incomprehensible numbers, like these huge numbers of casualties of war and sort of like hours of torture, like these things that we can't really understand because they're sort of beyond comprehension or beyond I guess reasonable thought, right? And so in order to process them, Adrian would choose a gesture and align it with a statement around some number. And so we ended up doing this in a class as well as a group and did a public performance honoring land defenders who had been killed the past year around the world. And that sort of holding that space for ourselves and for the people who kind of gave their lives to try to resist the exploitation of the earth. Like that was an incredible experience. And we brought that method to a gathering in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas in Mexico. And we're able to connect with people in that space who are also doing embodied movement. And then this past year, sort of building on both of those, a group of colleagues and I came up with basically just a short process to come into relationship with the crises we feel in our body. Like, how do we name that? What are the sensations? Like, just becoming attuned to that and then expressing some sort of movement based on that, whether it's sort of cathartic, like working through it, or sort of expressing what that feels like through motion, or celebrating, like any kind of way we wanted to be moving in our bodies. And then sort of doing that as a group. And so we did that at a couple of conferences as well. And I guess I would say just those experiences, like as much as I still have some theoretical threads that I want to tie together to make some more solid statements about them, those have been some of the most impactful experiences I've had in the PhD, by being in community in that way with people who you've never met, at a session at a conference. But this is a way to sort of build those bonds like more quickly than normal, because like that's like a deep knowing, right? Sitting with yourself and sitting with others when you're being fully present. Um, and I guess I feel like that is something I've also seen in some of the futures work, is where like we're invited to use our senses and envision different worlds and like feel what that is actually like. Um, so I guess I would love to hear, from you as well about, and this is kind of off script, but like, especially in disability studies and intersectionality, thinking of where our histories live and like how we have relationships with our bodies. How do you view that in your work? And what is sort of the essential part of that as we're like in these, I guess, like research agendas that are resisting like the dominant forms of knowing?
Yeah, I was thinking about it as you were talking. I think like in academia, we're very, well, not like we, but academia is very adverse to like having emotion. Like if you write in a paper like this makes me feel this way, it's like, okay, you're not objective because academia wants us to be like objective scientist, just like observing rather than experiencing. But I think like experience is like what drives like at least like my work. And I assume yours as well from what you said. And I don't think it's necessarily separable, and I don't think that we should have to essentially like to make a metaphor towards like autistic studies, to have to like constantly mask ourselves to fit this mold. We should be able to express ourselves. We should be able to acknowledge what we hold in our bodies. We should be able to acknowledge the way that like knowledge makes us feel. Because like when I do some of my work, like it is very painful to think about like, for example, the research I'm currently doing on P.T. Barnum, like he purchased in quotes an enslaved woman and then just abused her and had her on display until she died. Like that's not something that I can just sit there and be like, okay, that happened. That's like I have that sort of visceral reaction where I'm like, that's awful, and people have gone through so much. And I feel that connection like through time, through history, through community. Like I understand that like obviously I will never have that experience, but I can still empathize with it because like she was essentially part of my community. She was a disabled person. She was in disabled history, and even outside of that, like any marginalized history, like that is like any history essentially that has like that element of pain, that element of like oppression. It's like I kind of embody that when I think about it, and like because it's history, I do have the privilege of like not thinking about it all the time. But that doesn't mean that like I don't still live with that knowledge, that it doesn't like take up space in my life and in my body. And I think like not being able to express how you feel about it, not being able to have those emotional reactions, not being able to have that space to express your personhood within academia is very um oppressive. It definitely like repeats those like cyclical forms of oppression, and it doesn't allow for any progress or humanization within academia, which is why so much of like especially sociological like marginalized like studies are so constantly invalidated because it's like, oh, you study gender, but like it just is. You study disability, but like being disabled is just like a thing that is. It's like it's also a construct. Like you have to recognize that like it exists within a context the same way that like the concept of race like came from like a history, and without that knowledge you don't really understand anything. I mean, not like you can go through your life just fine not knowing it, but I think not having that information kind of is a detriment to your ability to be a citizen and to like fully experience like personhood. Like in my opinion, I think history is very important to like personal development. Um, and so I think like that's especially why like intellectual accessibility is so important to me, because like you shouldn't have to like feel disconnected from your own history. Like you shouldn't have to like learn a new like academic language to be able to understand like, oh, this is what was happening. Like this is what happened in indigenous boarding schools. This is what happened like when disabled people were institutionalized and sterilized without consent. Like this is what happened in Tuskegee experiments. Like you don't have to you shouldn't be barred from that knowledge. That shouldn't be something that like we are able to keep for ourselves without sharing, because that is like detrimental to progress, and that is detrimental to like other people's ability to be themselves, because just because they don't have as much privilege as us to be in academia.
Yeah, so you touched on this already, but I'd love to ask you the next question that I have here, which is how do we view, or how do you view the tensions between access and appropriation? I mean, within academia and beyond, but like in the same modern context that's shaped by colonialism, capitalism, and race.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to like value these fields like critical race theory, like disability studies, gender studies, like that kind of a thing. Um, because without that, like we don't really know how to approach modern concepts. Not like modern concepts, but like things that like have now become modern trends, like on social media when it was a trend to like pretend you were like uh Southern Belle in the antebellum South. Like you shouldn't like be able to do that without knowing what antebellum means. Um, and it's like it's not that everyone who was doing that was racist, um, but it was a racist action, and if they didn't understand that, then that is a failure of the system. And I think the system kind of wants to fail because it doesn't want to participate in these liberatory processes because it will have to examine itself and be critical of itself and acknowledge the people that it has been trying to ignore for so long. Um, like even very famous people like James Baldwin is like their work is still like not fully recognized. Like it wouldn't make it into the quote unquote Western canon, um, which is mostly what is accepted and what is taught, especially within literature. And since most universities have a literature requirement rather than a history requirement, it's like that is what is identity forming for these generations who are privileged enough to go to school and within um, populations that aren't getting educated within college. Like that is what's accessible. Like literature is what is accessible, especially for learning history. Like what we read like influences our lives. And I think like that especially should be examined for its impact, which I think is, especially within the literary studies field, it's extremely white and extremely male dominated. I recently had a class where my professor, it's like a graphic novel course, but has nothing to do with the Western canon. It is literally just about like let's look at the history of comics. Let's look at like this multimedia like art form. um and like let's try and express ourselves through it, like that kind of a thing. And then he got into an argument with the one black student in the class. I mean, there's like three people in the class, but he got into an argument with the one black girl, and he was like, people nowadays don't want to read Shakespeare, they don't want to read uh Milton. And it's like, and she was like, I find more value in more modern uh texts that talk about like having a black experience. And she was talking about how her experience with academia has been an inherently racist one. And it's like that is so powerful, and that like especially recognizing like the impact of literature within community, especially as writers, is so important. Um, but then of course our work is still like not really valued or recognized because the people who are heading the systems are either in the legacy of people who only value the Western canon. Like my teacher, like was a student of Harold Bloom, who like is the Western canon guy. Um, and like without that, like our work will continue to be devalued, and minimal progress at best will be made unless we can reach the public. Because even like you were saying, like within the spheres of academia, you will always be the marginalized person. But if you reach outside into the community, you will be part of a community and you can spread your work there and they will appreciate it. Because at the end of the day, I think as marginalized academics, like we're not writing, we're not doing research for the people who will just invalidate our work immediately and not find any value in it and not like be able to consider themselves critically. And it's not that I think it's without value to encourage these people to do that and like to encourage these people to do that work, but I don't think that's the job of marginalized academics, and that is certainly not a job I would like to take on, because I have had enough of direct ableism for the rest of my life, actually.
Yeah.
um, and I like just for me especially, I write mostly for my community. Like I
Mhm.
write with disabled understanding, with disabled knowledge in mind. And it's like even without that knowledge you will be able to understand it, but the sort of person that will value it is certainly not the person who doesn't find value in like modern literature. That is diverse, and that is about community, and that is about progress, and that is about historical pain, and
Mm.
that is about history and our connection to it and community. And again, like it is valuable to like educate those people, like the overeducated people who are overeducated in like white supremacy.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but like that isn't the job of every marginalized academic. And I think that's important to like recognize.
Yeah. That reminds me a lot of like of several conversations. I'm trying to remember the name of the um blogger. I need to find their name. I'll find it and we'll post it along with the video once I remember. But they were talking about sort of these different kind of roles in social change and transformation, um, as far as work. So you were talking about sort of these like systems change, like structural deconstruction, or like even um sort of incremental progress within structural reordering. And that feels thankless to me too. Like it's that sort of, being that one person who's taking on that labor. um I've been in that space a lot as being, you know in such close proximity to whiteness and yet still holding a, racialized identity. Often I can be in spaces and not be seen as a threat and sort of just be like absorbed by this, white centered, or spaces that cater to whiteness in their entirety. And I feel so that is one role that I've had to take on. And it's so easy to see in every single diversity panel, usually women of color or some combo like that. Like you have these multiply marginalized intersectional people doing all the labor, burning out, being not thanked, like thankless work. So that's one type of work. Another type of work, sort of harm reduction, right? Like, and some of what you're saying about policy change and just sort of redirecting resources, I think that's part of where we're at, is like, how do we help people survive and thrive better now? you know People and environments, and more than human creatures that we're in relation with. And then there's this sort of like dreaming and like building new futures role of like, okay, well, we're going to be the ones to make a permaculture farm now. We're going to do these different things, like hold like community pedagogy, like where we educate ourselves within our circles, like whether it's a queer reading group outside of academia or whatnot. And like those are all valid and important. Like I think all of those have to happen. um and some to some extent, like the people in those institutions that are like aware of how to keep things ordered, like there's value in that type of knowledge, whether or not, that's for now or like when there's a new system. Like being able to run a system is important. So I mean, I feel that, I want to acknowledge that labor and also agree with you. That's like, I'm trying really hard to push towards like this space of like inspiring people, bringing people together, helping people organize, whether it's direct activism or not. And that brings me to this other thing that my committee chair told me. So Alex Igloro is a wonderful academic and mother and mentor, and um, I guess just a delightful human being, who I admire a lot. And she was talking about this idea of, as an intersectional person in the academe, like finding that community outside and working for and with those folks is like, that can be what motivates us. And also, it can be useful to think of our academic community as well, like finding people like each other, like through HASTAC, and like beyond, finding ways to kind of use the machinery. I think like La Paperson's The Third University is Possible book talks about like, okay, well, if we're these cyborgs, like if we're like, having to be in between and like piece together what it means to be human in academia as people who are marginalized, or holding spaces, that are, you know, resisting the domination of like just certain types of schooling. Like there's ways to take that machinery and use it for good. So I mean, there's so many approaches. I think that remembering that we have community in academia and trying to develop that so that when sort of we have students coming to us who want to learn, and that's the avenue they have. I think that's important, as well as remembering, like you're saying, what the work's for. Like maybe I'm writing the reports that are informing activists and like organizers on the ground, when they're going to make policy change, or when they're instituting changes within their own community. So thinking about like how can we um directly create knowledge that is of use, and that, like, I think that's part of our role, right?
Yeah, definitely. Should we move on to uh I think we just have one question left.
Mhm.
Um, envision a future where policy works for liberation. Tell a story of how your work helps bring that to future. I can't read out loud. It's really bad. Helps bring that future into reality. And then the addendum, uh, in a better world, what work would you be doing?
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I kind of sprang the second part on you.
No, no, that's
Um,
great.
yeah, I think policy is very important to progress because like I recognize that like we're not gonna like have a revolution through policy and it's not like the end goal. But I think it is a good step in the like if it's used properly because we have seen how harmful policy can be. Um, and I would like to be part of like silently part of the people who like make it not as bad and make like resources available to people like whenever possible. Like I will fight those battles with like having my privilege in mind, having my community in mind. Like I will wholeheartedly spend my life doing that. Um, like even outside the circle of academia, like I will advocate for those things and I will convince people of their like roots in justice. And I think just like at the end of the day, what like policy is supposed to do is to provide equitable resources to everyone. Um, like I think, especially with like how many people in America are impoverished, it's especially important. And of course, there's like the downside of policy, which is that most of it isn't international. Um, and most of my work, if not all of my work, is entirely focused on America. So there isn't that like international perspective, but there is like the basis of like American identity within like all these marginalized identities going from like disabled Americans to Asian Americans to Black Americans and like these communities spread beyond just like America. So like the impact will still be there. Like I uh one person who I look up to a lot is Judy Heumann, who did a lot of policy work. Um, and she, after like she did policy in America, would like go to different countries that were considering having similar like liberatory practices for their disabled like civilians. Not all of which were particularly effective, but it was still like progress. And she would go there and be like, yes, these are my people, even though they're in different countries, like this is my community. And like recognizing her privilege, but then also recognizing like the shared identity, which I think is really important, especially since my work is so somewhat heavily nationalistic. Um, and then I yeah, I added the addendum of what would I do in a better world because I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, I really like history, and like no matter where I would be, I would still be looking for these stories of our past for like not only that like identity building thing, but like that sense of community beyond time. and like beyond space. And I would still be studying history. I would still probably be a writer, like studying writing studies, that kind of a thing. Um, I would not be doing policy because I was thinking about that and I was like, I don't actually like policy. Like I'm just studying it because I have the privilege to. Um, and it's not really a passion, but I have other things that I'm passionate about that I am lucky enough to pursue. Um, but what I have to lean into most heavily because of my privilege of being like in the spaces that I am is the policy work because I have the understanding and I have the knowledge and I have the privilege to do this work. Whether or not I enjoy it is somewhat beside the point because like it is necessary work that needs to be done and I have other things that like serve my artistic side and serve my artistically minded community side where like my work can still be shared with my community through history and through writing, but I think where I am most useful is policy.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you for fighting that fight, the invisible fight too. That's a lot of work, I know. Um, I guess I envision a world where policies are like they fit the the shape that they need to, like they're not imposed in a hierarchical set, um, sort of set of rules, um, where accountability and like mutual respect is centered for like in terms of like regulation comes through accountability, and I also think restoration comes through, so the idea of like restorative justice and also like transformation. I feel like those are all things that I would envision seeing all the time is not having the expectations um of knowing exactly how something's going to work when you come to a place, which is it's chaos. It sounds chaotic, and it in some ways I think it is, and it's a beautiful kind of reality of being human, right? Is that things are only ordered in certain ways, right? Like that's where science comes in, right? Finding patterns and order and understanding that, but like forcing things to be hierarchical, forcing things to be objective, like I feel like that's going to be lost in that future. And like there can still be joy in finding patterns, but also there's joy in like the chaos, right? So this makes me think of resquache, like the idea of resquache as like a transborder Chicane like assemblage of like the basis of it is like we have everything we need already to develop solutions to what we are facing, and sort of this patchworked, collaged, like bridged, intersectional, like however we want to think of that, like mess. Like I think that is like the chaotic joy I envision. And I think policies will like support that. So I think the other thing that is informing how I think of policy is institutional analysis and governance from the commons perspective. Like that's how I was trained in my master's. And I acknowledge like that's still very I guess like at this point sort of traditionally academic and scientific even, which is fine. I would say like at the same time it was very revolutionary in the academic space when it was conceived of, which was like, okay, top down government versus free market, like those are the only two options, and this idea of like no, bottom up collective action can work and be sustainable, like that was a really, I mean, that was an important contribution. And I feel ultimately the seed of that is true is, yeah, like together people can weave new stories. And like I think policies should just kind of be sustaining the right stories and making space for new stories. So I guess in that new world, like I would also be like working in stories. Like that's definitely something I think we share. Lately I've been involved in speculative fiction spaces a little bit more through my cultural communication colleagues, Jenna Hanchey and Laura Lemaster in particular in our Hugh Downs School for Human Communication. And so using different modalities to express knowledge and to ask research questions, I think is really special and something that sustainability as a field needs to look at more. So I'm hoping that, I could be kind of bridging some of those spaces, or like as a traditional academic would call it, like filling those gaps. But that's not really how I want to think of it. Like I want to kind of like network some of these concepts together. And I view, again, policy as like having to be adaptive in a way that we can't really even imagine right now. Like having worked for the state for 5 years, like I've seen what it takes to make a rule like happen, and like the boxes that have to be checked and the type of information that's valid and sought and where our resources are put. And I feel like those values are all going to have to shift if that's what we're looking at is how do we support everyone's collective liberation. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me also of like the twisted way we kind of view policy now because of how uh disastrous and corrupt our world is. Like when I study policy, I'm like, oh wow, like that's so cool. Like gay people got to get married. And then I'm like what like why am I celebrating basic human rights? And then there's also the element of like looking at really awful cases like Buck v. Bell, um, and stuff like that. And it's like, I don't want to be part of that policy because like part of me like loses hope when I see policies like that. I'm like, maybe we just shouldn't give anyone that kind of power. Like no matter how representative the government is, like no one should be able to like decide that like disabled people can't have children just because they're like perceived as mentally disabled. Which is Buck v. Bell was like forced sterilization for Carrie Carrie Buck, yeah, um, who was like institutionalized for I think having schizophrenia or something like that, or at least her mother was, and she kind of got pushed into that system because of how the system works. um, and like even institutionalization, like no one should have that kind of power to decide that you get trapped somewhere forever. Like we should not have institutions. We should never have conceived of these institutions. Um, and like we like conservatorships, like we should have never thought about that too much because like you should like people should be able to make informed and supported decisions. And I understand that like legally you do need some support like with certain disabilities, but it's also like that doesn't give somebody a right over your life. Um, and that's like a very abusive relationship where it's like again, part of me just says home, I'm like, no one should have that kind of power. Like the only person you really have autonomy over is yourself. The only thing you have control over is yourself, and even there to a certain extent. So like why are we even allowed to have policies when we so clearly don't know what we're doing? Um, and so we should just have like groundwork policies that are like basic decency to like uphold that. But even then, it's like, whose decency are we going off of? Who is making these rules? Like, the idea of Christian nationalism is based off a very twisted version of Christianity, where like if there was an actual Christian nation, it would just be like chill. Like if it was like actually like at least in my interpretation biblical, it would just be like a normal place with like no like racism, like the conservative Christian nationalist one, and it's like That's why like representation of church and state is so important. But then again, it's like that's crumbling. So it's like part of me does just lose hope. Like we shouldn't have done that. Like no one should have that kind of control, and there feels like there isn't a solution, even though I like believe in like collective autonomy and collective activism and collectivism in general. I'm still like, but what about the groups that I don't like? And it's like, it's valid that I don't like some of them, and that's just like fine. But then there are others that I don't like because they don't want me to be alive. So what about those people? Like, because an ideal world for me that wouldn't exist. It's not that like everyone who thinks that would like die. It's that they would like be educated and like that kind of a thing. But it's still like I feel like I sometimes just don't have the hope that that will ever happen. I think, especially in academia, that's a very hard thing to hold on to.
Yeah, I hear you. I think something I've been thinking about this whole conversation is obviously Palestine and the idea of liberation and what that looks like. And I mean that I also the connection you're making to just access to life, access to dignity. I mean, I think like fighting for those things, like again, comes back to that, like that's a role that's very important right now. And I'm really glad that you're working on it, even though there's days where it feels like hopeless. I also think like, yeah, like every action, maybe it's a drop, but like you can make a choice, right? Like I think that's something that is so easy to feel like no choice is a choice, like that every choice is complicit and there's no repercussion that matters. But like being able to make that choice is still an enactment of that freedom. And so I guess, yeah, I would just, yeah, I guess and try to encourage you, like, you're right, like everyone should be able to have the freedom to live a dignified life, as if it doesn't affect other people, right? But I think that's very complicated. I think about like in Palestine and in Israel, and just the way that the environment has been controlled. I mean, beyond the atrocities of trying to eliminate people, like there's also been just massive changes to the land and how like forests have just been planted and water is being desalinized. And so just thinking of like the extremes to which these types of institutions, these imaginaries have gone to, I think I'm hopeful that like your creative writing and like that will also be a part of that change, is like giving us hope and also more creative ways to believe that things can be different. Um, so yeah, I think what you said about having roots in justice and like making sure everyone has those resources to live a dignified life, I think those are things I'm going to hold with me. Thank you so much for bringing all of those to our conversation.
Yeah, I kept forgetting this every time I went to speak, but like what you've been saying about I think you mentioned like not really knowing how like embodiment connects with water, and it made me think about like disabled approaches to environmental activism, where like a lot of environmental activism can be very individualistic, which like it seems you're not really doing. Where it's like don't use plastic straws, but then it's like some people need plastic to survive. And like that's fine, and
Mhm.
it's not like they're bad people, it's just that like the problem isn't us, the problem is like systems. Um, and it reminds me a lot of like especially like indigenous understandings and disabled understandings of like our relationship to the environment, where it's like sometimes it's an extension of us, sometimes it's something that celebrates us, sometimes it's something that we celebrate. And it's just
Mhm.
like this intricate connection of like whenever there is violence, there is land destruction. Whenever there is a genocide, there is a cutoff of resources that like reminds us of how intricately tied we are to our land and to water. Is like to bring it back to that. Like it's so like intricately tied to us that it's just very interesting to like imagine that kind of embodiment while also avoiding like anthropomorphization, um to like understand that like there's forms of embodiment that don't necessarily have to have like traditional bodies, and that can extend beyond like the concept of self and into the concept of like just being, essentially.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely reminds me a lot of some of the knowledge I've been fortunate enough to be part of, like hearing and learning with in Indigenous water knowledge classes. So Myla Vicente Carpio was one of my professors, was awesome. And she brought up the idea of like you're sort of saying anthropomorphizing, but water is life. We've heard that so much. And all life depends on water. And at the same time, she questioned like, what about water as life, as sentient, as having memory, as being a source and a site of so many of these violences as well as celebrations that, like births, um, or drownings. Like there's so much complexity to water as body. And that's part of like I'm trying to figure out how to tie that in. I think it depends a lot on the cases that I've been looking at, but specifically like as it like flows through environments and ecosystems and nurtures different beings. Like that's definitely part of like I want that to be the parallel, the metaphor, and also like the situated site for the like a lot of the work that I'm doing. So thank you for bringing that back up. Um, yeah, I'd love to talk more in the future. Do you have any other questions or thoughts before we close out?
Not that I can think of, but your work sounds really interesting with like embodiment and like environmental work. It's very interesting. Like,
Yeah.
Robin Wall Kimmerer,
Mhm.
uh, yeah, like her work, I've like all of my professors and I have been like, oh, this is so like her work, and it's like that's the highest compliment. But it does kind of remind me of that, of like
Mhm.
using nature as a metaphor, but also as a site, and also as like a being in and of itself. Like that's so important and so interesting. Um, that is like part of like the hopeless part of me that was talking about policy. I'm also like,
Yeah.
but humans are so like they're just little guys. Like we
Yeah.
like live with nature, and that's so cool. Like part of
Mhm.
like life is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really grateful to be alive, and I really appreciate you bringing that gratefulness back into our conversation too. Yeah. Well, thank you. I think I'll stop the recording.
All right.